to save their immortal souls, of course. Again, I'm not arguing biblical ethics makes no positive contributions. They prove, in a sense, that situational ethics can work, that ethics can evolve coherently as a community is faced with new situations. And of course, the Bible has many, many good lessons and stories to tell. My point is simply that no one religious community has a monopoly on ethical insight. That societies, especially pluralistic secular ones, cannot base ethics on a single and unchanging tradition. So what are your ethics, your values, your meaning and purpose? Whatever they may be, they can't just be adopted wholesale from an external transcendental entity, because then they don't belong to you, they belong to God. A believer must make a personal decision with their own conscience to choose the ethics of their community or their God, and that is an existential choice we all face. Furthermore, Lawrence Kohlberg describes 6 stages of moral development, and I want to suggest that the Bible really plays on the lower of those stages, the divine punishments and rewards, rather than in truly formulating a universal set of ethical principles, which is what I think is really our challenge here. The quest to develop ethics without God is both ancient and varied, but the fact is that people have been doing moral philosophy without God for thousands of years. Aristotle, one of the earliest thinkers, excuse me, if there's water that I can grab, that would be great. Aristotle was one of the earliest moral philosophers, and his thinking dominated all the way up to the Middle Ages. He actually had very little use for religious ethics. He based his morals on human nature, and his ethic was based on a commitment to personal excellence. Then came Epicurus, who taught that one should seek pleasure through tranquility, limiting our desires and fears, including fear of God and death. The centrality of maximizing happiness and minimizing pain continues to be developed in consequentialist schools of ethical philosophy, and Adam responded to an extent to the consequentialism or utilitarianism. In consequentialist theories of ethics, we often have to choose between competing goods. And again, there's a very human or humanist project for us. Now, responding in part to consequentialist theories of ethics were deontological philosophers like Kant, for whom specific actions could be identified as right or wrong without necessarily being embedded in consequences. His belief was that reason could find universal norms. A particular example of a deontological framework is deontological or natural rights libertarianism. As libertarianism has at its core a belief that we each own ourselves, some libertarians feared, and I think this is your fear, that utilitarianism could deprive us of individual rights. As a classic thought experiment, very similar to the one you mentioned, suppose in a hospital there are 5 sick patients, each with a failing organ, and in comes a perfectly healthy person, young person. If that young person were killed, his organs could be harvested to save 5. Some libertarians feared such a loss of individuality in a purely consequentialist framework. Utilitarians responded, pointing out that the problem here is epistemological blindness, because if we could see the full consequences of our actions, we would realize that the kind of society that maximizes total happiness is one where we do respect individual human rights. And libertarians responded, suggesting that there was such a thing as consequentialist libertarianism, where you could ground a belief in libertarian ethics based on the idea that the free market was the best system for ultimately bringing about happiness and the greater good. So my analysis there is a little detailed, but I think it shows an example of a fascinating and a lively debate entirely in the sphere of secular ethical inquiry. I'm going to skip over virtue ethics, but that's a whole other domain as well. John Rawls is probably the best known 20th century political philosopher. That's great. Might need image. Rawls had a theory of justice as fairness, which was based on a thought experiment in which individuals were to build a society that would maximize the well-being of all concerned, but in which there existed what he called a veil of ignorance that was placed on everybody before society was actually implemented. So you wouldn't know if you would be at the top of society or at the bottom. The concept of an inherent human right to fairness, as found in Rawls and many systems of secular ethics, is hard to ground in an appeal to the Bible, because the concept of an inherent human right is replaced in the Bible with rights bestowed or acquired by God, often only on people by virtue of membership in a select community. The UN Universal Human Rights Declaration, which I think is one of the most progressive documents ever written for the planet as a whole. In that declaration, it is an individual, not a group, that is the focus of our concern. And it might be compared to the International Human Rights Declaration drafted by the Organization for the Islamic Conference, obviously a religious body. That declaration loses the concept of individualism by focusing instead on the protection of the community of believers and sometimes of the religion of Islam itself. Insisting, for example, on censorship and the closing down of the open society to protect religion from defamation. And it wasn't that long ago that Christianity, too, thought that protecting ideas from criticism, rather than people from harm, was at the core of morality. And I can't help pointing out that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is modeled on some of these UN documents, like the Universal Human Rights Declaration and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is far from being grounded on biblical values. In fact, many of the Ten Commandments would be found unconstitutional by our courts. They would violate freedom of religion by commanding monotheism, and freedom of speech by condemning blasphemy. Let me to my conclusion now, I promise. The kind of secular ethical thinking that I've described is not only available to atheists. Those who believe in a God can, and I would argue often do, ultimately ground their moral decisions in a completely secular framework. It might actually be a safer approach, because if you're a theist, and you ground your morals in a religion or ultimately in God belief, then if, God forbid, you should lose your belief in God, you'll lose your ethical foundation. But if your ethical foundation, framework, exists in the natural world, you don't need to worry. The natural world isn't going anywhere. It occurs to me that maybe I've been using framework, and I shouldn't be using that word. Commandments are certainly not the right word either. Ultimately, the reason we may have trouble debating this issue, theist versus atheist, is that I'm not arguing for a single ethical foundation, but for a different ethical epistemology, a different method to gain ethical insights, almost a scientific method that is constantly evolving. Not that science provides ethics, that we can find it in a test tube, but that the scientific values of fallibility and open-ended inquiry, where any premise is open to challenge, that those values should mark our approach in this area. It's a feature of science to look at, it's a feature of ethical inquiry to look at it in a scientific light, analogous to the way science is done, because there our understanding continually deepens as we progress toward a better and better grasp of truth. And in that way you can get out of circular reasoning. You see, circular reasoning is the risk when you base your morality on a foundation that itself requires validation. And neither secularists nor theists are immune from that vulnerability. But ultimately, I'm in favor of rigorous and lively debates as we engage in an exciting project to gain ethical awareness. It's a very human project. It's one that God, by the way, doesn't seem to favor, because original sin was to eat from the tree of knowledge, not of any knowledge, but of knowledge of good and evil. But I think that that act was akin to Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. It was a rebellion against the idea that humans would ever be fulfilled just by following commandments, rather than enjoying the sweet taste of freedom of thought within our human ethical inquiry. Thank you very much.
Questions? Tim?
So, Justin, what would you say is the foundation of your moral system? You mentioned science, you mentioned the ontological thought by Kant. What do you think?
Yeah, so I was trying to just sketch out sort of a very, very brief history of secular ethical reasoning rather than give you my own view. What I'm heartened by, I suppose, is that some of these different schools of thought can come to a consensus. I don't think we'll ever have the answer to what is the one rule for deciding on what's right or what's wrong. As I was alluding to, I think it's not like that. I think it's a constantly evolving, progressive, almost scientific, but again, as a method, not that we can see what's right or wrong in a microscope or a telescope or anything, but that it is akin to a method of inquiry. I didn't mention virtue ethics, by the way, but virtue ethics is another way of looking at morality, where you're looking at the sort of the character traits of a moral agent. And with virtue ethics, you can come often to the same conclusion about what's right or wrong as you might through deontological reasoning or consequentialist reasoning. The point is that you can come at morality from all these different kinds of schools of thought. And again, that the hope is that project of secular philosophy, or secular ethical philosophy rather, will bring us to a consensus, at least on the big rules of right from wrong. But I'm not a moral philosopher, and I can only give you a synopsis of my research in the area. I can't give you my own moral theory. I'm not developing one.
What are your thoughts on, or first of all, how do you define conscience, and where, in your personal opinion, where do you think we developed that?
Wow, how much time do I have? I really don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to define conscience. Nobody really does. It's another exciting scientific project. What I can tell you though is I don't see consciousness as being all or nothing. I think it exists on a spectrum. I think in a sense, if we look at the animal kingdom, I didn't get into sort of evolutionary understandings of ethics. We can maybe a bit later. But I think that ethical awareness, in a sense, can be seen to be grasped in some mammals, and some social mammals certainly. I go through examples of monkeys or primates that show an appreciation for assisting their kin. Usually it's kind of a kin selection thing, with avoiding pain or gaining pleasure, just as we do. So I don't think either morals or consciousness is only something that humans enjoy. I think there are qualitative differences, of course, between the animals and humans, just as we can reason. Other animals don't have the same developed reasoning capabilities. I think that we can use the reasoning, by the way, to refine our ethical understanding. That's one way in which our ethics is, of course, more developed than anything in the animal kingdom. But I would just answer your question by stating that I don't know what consciousness is exactly, but I do think that we're seeing rudimentary signs of it emerging within other mammals, certainly within primates.
Go ahead.
Towards the end of your remarks, you were talking about how we could use scientific methods in the field of ethics, and I believe, and I think I'm very close to quoting you. You said every premise should be open to question.
Something like that, yeah.
Yes. So, how do you do science if even every scientific every premise on which science is based is open to question?
Well, this is certainly a raging debate in the philosophy of science. I like to look at scientific development as sort of a web of knowledge or insight. And in this web, you have at the core certain beliefs, I guess we can call them beliefs, certain beliefs that are well grounded within the web because they're connected to so many other facts and observations about the universe. At the edge of the web, you have ideas or beliefs that are only tied to the rest of the web very sparsely, if you will. These are areas of our scientific understanding that are more vulnerable to being rewritten. But that's the method of science, right? This is why I was getting at my conclusion, that maybe the debate is difficult because I'm looking at it as more, what's the best method to approach ethical questions? And I do think that ethical inquiry is a good way to elucidate or to describe that, rather than looking for one framework or one set of commandments. I don't think we have or ever will find that for our morality. That's why I was making the comparison to scientific understanding.